ghosts, psychics, pendulums, curses, hexes. We welcome you here to Friday Night Dark in the realm of the night. Come join us and listen to this week's presentation, and we bid you welcome.
Good evening. This is Drew, and I welcome you back to Friday Night Dark. Hey, tonight, I'm going to talk about hexes again, but from a different point of view. A while back, I was asked, how do you know if you're hexed? And I sheepishly admitted the one way that I know openly was one I had read about, and then later saw videos on. Granted, I know more about putting a hex on someone rather than detecting one, but the one way I know I was supposed to let you know, it comprised of two matches being burned and then floating them on a bowl of water. Now, you figure, how do you know there's a hex on you? There was a movie and a book that talked tactics and said the best way to avoid a trap is to know it's there. Perhaps the best way to avoid being hexed, or at least for a short time as possible, is to know it's there. But how do you know when you are hexed? Is there really a surefire method? Well, it's multiple answers here, so let's talk about how it was brought into this idea. Someone asked me how to tell if you're hexed, and in one of my moments of remembering something that I had read and saw, I talked about that match ritual, if you will, that talked about, a way to tell. And of course, later I was asked if I might be hexed and decided I would test the theory. Now, I tried with the matches. I started by lighting them and then blowing them out and putting them in the bowl of water, stirring about 6 times and then asking as it was stirred in that clockwise fashion, asking if I was hexed, and let the matches I lit know that I wanted to find out if I was hexed. So I did that. And an interesting thing actually happened. Nothing. Actually, I take that back. They ended up side by side. So I didn't know. Was I hexed? Well, no, I wasn't. At least I don't think. But then I tried with toothpicks. And they, of course, I did the same thing, but obviously there was no fire involved. But they were touching on one end. And so either way, I guess I was safe, I think. Now, the way that it works is that if the matches or the toothpicks ever formed an X, then I was hexed. And if they were apart from each other or they were slightly touching, that meant that someone tried, or they were side by side, someone tried. But it didn't work. And I think that was the one thing that was interesting. So I had to say, well, maybe I'm safe, I think. But I had to ask myself, does this process of asking and seeing if I was hexed, did it really work? Well, psychologically, I guess it gives me some comfort that maybe there wasn't anything going on, right? But does it mean I was hexed or no? Well, the short and clear answer is no, of course not. Those matches floating side by side in a bowl of water and didn't reliably mean that I had a hex on me, but at the same time, I didn't say that I didn't. But the deeper story is a little bit more interesting, and it fits right into the weird stuff that I like to explore. So let's talk about the obvious. With the match test, it actually does measure the match in water ritual, should I say. It measures a kind of like folk magic and whether or not you might be hexed. And in the traditional version, As I mentioned before, those two lit matches are dropped into a bowl of water. Their behavior is interpreted symbolically, but not scientifically. Now, there's basically going to be the key. The movement of matches in water is governed by the actual surface tension of I can't talk today. The surface tension of the liquid that you're using, water in this case. And water is traditionally used, but I've actually talked to somebody once and they said that they did the same thing with like a special kind of like oil. And I don't remember what it was that they shared with me, but then again, there was something spooky about it because when I talked to them about it, they also said, "Hey, I listened to your thing on bay leaves, and you know, they use bay leaves and they put them in flour to keep the bugs out. Did you know that?" And I no, I was totally floored because it never once came up in all my research. But I digress. But here was the thing about the surface tension of the liquid, in this case water, is that if you contrast that with wood density and the tiny currents, not spiritual forces, you're basically going to see that it's going to create a pattern that won't ever create that X. So I had to ask, why did the matches actually drift together? And it comes back to the surface tension of the actual water that I used. Matches tend to move side by side because of that. Wood naturally does float, and it seeks equilibrium. You see, it pushes down, kind of like if you were to set a ball on top of, say, I don't know, a blanket on a bed. And it doesn't actually fall through, but it pushes down just enough. Now, a ball on say a blanket isn't necessarily the same because, you know, it's not going to fall completely through, but the idea is that the density of the wood displacing the water makes it float. And that's basically one of the things that goes on. So with that surface tension, it's kind of like what they call the Cheerios effect. If you ever look at your favorite cereal that you might have eaten as a kid growing up in the morning and you ask, you know, why do they always group together like that? It's that same idea. But then there's something else that influences. There's tiny vibrations or temperature differences in the water that create currents. And so the two matches end up being next to each other, which is the most common physical outcome, like those Cheerios or whatever cereal you want to put there. And it's really not a paranormal indicator. Now, this doesn't mean that it won't happen. It just is the most common outcome. So, in essence, the reality of that water and wood and everything that you do when you stir it up like that, there's a good chance that they're going to end up saying no. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not hexed. It just means that, you know, it's probably going to be one of those self-soothing things where, like, maybe I don't know, a bad bowl of chocolate or ice cream when things are not going so good for you. I'm just going to give it right there. But in a magic tradition, you have to ask yourself, what would it mean? Well, different traditions interpret differently the common ideas of what these things would mean. So match behavior, if they drift together, someone is thinking about you or influencing your energy. Perhaps maybe if they drift apart, there's no influence. If they cross tightly, possibly negative intention or crossed intentions. If one sinks, it says that there's an energetic exhaustion of spiritual or spiritual depletion. I can't talk today. Spiritual depletion. Now, I want you to notice that when I was doing this, even in folklore, hex is not the default interpretation. It's more about influences, attention, emotional entanglement. And so I had to say, well, maybe there's something to that. Well, the balance take is that it can be a symbolic ritual and a way to check your intuition. Or it could also be a storytelling tool, which, of course, is working here tonight because that's precisely what I'm doing. I'm telling you about this from a certain point of view. And I mean, I'm not trying to draw it from like, you know, it works or it doesn't work. I just want to make sure that, I stay in the middle of the road as I've always tried to do. But it can't always diagnose a hex, and it won't necessarily tell you if there's a curse or an attachment or some kind of psychic interference. I kept reading that it's more reliable. It's no more reliable than reading tea leaves or cloud shapes. They could be meaningful only in a symbolic sense or psychological sense, meaning that, hey, I got some sense of relief. But yet, I have read tea leaves, and I did read coffee grounds, and I do know it's not so easy when I have been revisited and told by people that they want to know how I knew the things that I did. That's going to be hard to answer. And it's not a subject I'm going to bring up today. But yes, I have done those things in the past. Yes, I have done a few other things in the past. But the truth be told here, for just a moment, that as I did this, it was, for some alternate information. And I know people sometimes will ask me, did you mean to do this? And, you just always have this gift or something like that. And I said, no. Any form of divination I think anybody can do from anywhere, or anybody can do at any time. But I think you have to be geared for it. It's a frame of mind. But I digress again. So, as I mentioned before, there are more reliable indicators used in folklore and paranormal investigations, such as repeated patterns of misfortune with no logical cause. Perhaps maybe you might run into persistent emotional heaviness or intrusive thoughts, sudden interpersonal conflict or isolation. Maybe perhaps there's some recurring nightmares or sleep disturbances. This latter portion right here, the sleep disturbances, I know what it is. It's overactive kidneys on my part, but I sometimes wonder if that might be a thing, right? Right. Also, there could be objects breaking or malfunctioning in clusters. Have you ever had days where you just couldn't keep anything and kept dropping stuff? Have you ever had days where nothing went right, even though you did everything in your power to avoid issues? And it just didn't go right, just went sideways for whatever reason? You fill in the blank. Yeah, believe it or not. People say these are signs. Yeah, billboard signs maybe, but they're still signs. Now, feeling drained perhaps in a way that doesn't match your life circumstances. You're getting plenty of sleep, but you just can't get yourself out of bed. Perhaps maybe that extra cup of coffee that should have kept you going and it's just not working. Yeah. Guess what? These are things to consider that might actually be that feeling that perhaps there could be circumstances, forces at work, negativity that has been brought upon you from an outside and external factor or person. And so I've mentioned before, I know I've talked about using bay leaves about the beginning of the year, and cinnamon for that matter, to do and influence certain things, not only to influence good outcomes, but in some cases they could be brought about to use bad outcomes. Keep that in mind. So, if that were the case, then I guess the first step is always ruling out normal explanations. And what's left as unexplainable in all those situations might still be a clue. Now, absolutely, this is where things get genuinely fascinating, because a professional grade hex check looks nothing like the old match in water trick. It's structural, it's layered, and it's designed to separate. There's the signals, as I mentioned before, the folklore signals. There's the psychological patterns, perhaps. There's environmental factors, symbolic meaning, and genuine anomalous patterns that might occur and crop up from time to time. So I'm going to talk about a kind of protocol a disciplined paranormal investigator would use, and it kind of fits with the methodical folkloric meets science style. So if you're looking at it from an investigator grade hex check, a structured, repeatable, evidence-based approach to evaluating whether someone is under crossed conditions, negative intention, or uh, folk magic hex type of situation. You want to do a baseline. So before anything mystical is considered, in setting that baseline, you want to check for patterns that feel supernatural but often aren't. Sudden stress spikes, sleep disruption, major life changes, burnout, emotional overload, grief, conflict, or unresolved tension. Does these all sound familiar? Yes. I know it sounds kind of vague, but let's get to it. I mean, this is some of the stuff that is usually wished upon and looked at. So, of course, it's going to be in that fashion. Now, one thing for sure I would probably say is that if you see that there might be an explanation to some things going on, and you can rule out, like I can't talk today, environmental factors that create a sense of oppression or bad luck, like perhaps maybe there could be an air quality issue, dust, mold, whatever. There could be EMF sources, faulty wiring, or appliances. If you're wondering how that goes into things, it has actually been proven that if you're around a lot of electronic equipment or the high electrical influences, wiring, places that generate a lot of electricity, it does actually influence your moods. And in some cases, there are a sharp increase in psychological and, depression type behavior that has been attributed to folks that work in places like this. This includes data centers, server rooms, networkers, telecommunications people who work in a central office with a lot of copper, a lot of electricity, and a lot of phone calls. I knew somebody a long time ago that showed me an old switch that was for a local exchange carrier that no longer exists, but it was one of the last the Mohican places that actually had the cars that clattered. And believe you me, it's maddening. If you ever heard one, you'd know exactly what I was talking about. All day long. And I really feel for the poor technicians that had to go into these places and fix something that wasn't working, or a call processor or whatnot. And they worked with these special cards that they clattered all day long. I'm going to tell you, that's something else. But really, I think it helps underscore what I'm talking about here. If it's something along those guidelines, probably not a hex condition. But they can mimic these types of conditions, right? Now, once you do that, you want to look at the second part of this. There could be folkloric symptom analysis. And that goes back to repeated misfortune in clusters, sudden interpersonal conflict out of nowhere, feeling drained. There could be a sense of being watched. Scopisthesia, I think, is the word I should be using there, but let's just stay with feeling watched. There could be unexplained irritability or heaviness. Animals avoiding you, especially cats, perhaps. Dogs. I've talked about that in the past. They're good judges of character, aren't they? Yeah. Or perhaps maybe you could be one of those closet gardeners, or you might have a few herbs that you're growing and they just all of a sudden stop growing and they just die for no reason. Now, there was something that I remember reading also, that if in fact you had, what's the word I'm looking for here? If in fact you opened up your refrigerator and you got out your normal milk and it just tasted sour and you just bought it yesterday, no, you didn't leave it out and your refrigerator is probably working just fine. The problem is that was one of the signs that in fact you were in a hexed house. And I remember once that I was at someone's house. So we just bought like a whole quart of milk. We brought it in, put it in the refrigerator, and I took it out later to have some coffee, and it tasted nasty. I mean, I like, what the heck? I looked at it, and it had a date that was good and everything. I took a whiff of what was in there, and oh my God, it felt like someone left it out all night. So I asked everyone, did you leave the milk out? And everyone's like, what are you talking about? It's like, you smell. And they're all like, we just bought this. I said, I know. And then someone said, well, take it back. Now, they came back a little bit later because I was thinking, do we walk into a hexed house situation? And they took the milk back and they said, hey, what are you trying to pull on us? And they got an explanation sheepishly from the person that they did have a batch of milk that was left out too long, and so it spoiled. And the person there didn't bother telling anyone. But there you go. I mean, that's just one of those things. You see how it is. But if it wasn't an explanation, they couldn't explain it. You're in a hexed house. What would have been worse is if we had bought another one and it spoiled the next morning. And there were other things that were said with it, but hopefully you get the meaning. Now, you're probably thinking, does this prove anything really, or is it just mapping patterns? Well, let's look at another thing. You can definitely incorporate, the intuitive layer to this. Sometimes people would start doing things. This is where you have that saltwater bowl test, perhaps, and you see crystallization methods. Someone might burn a candle and see what the behavior is. Is it steady, or is it sputtering? Is it leaning to a certain way? Maybe they have a pendulum and they start checking to see what's going on. There is one thing I ran into, was an egg cleansing test, and it's called Limpia. And you're reading the egg afterward, and basically you just kind of put it over yourself or whatnot, and then you sit there and you crack it into some water, and then you see what happens. And it's got its own thing. It's pretty crazy. But then there's another thing. It's called a smoke reading. You would use sage, incense, or resin, and they would basically tell you one way or the other if there was something going on by the way the smoke acted. Now, I remember talking to someone about chaos once, and I used a cigarette as a metaphor, if you will. And I had lit it. It's no secret that I used to smoke. And I laid the cigarette down into an ashtray, and you see the straight smoke going straight up from it. And then as it goes up, eventually it starts to scatter in all these weird directions. And I said, this is an example of chaos. It's straight up to a certain point, and then it just goes mad. And someone said, hey, that's a great example. But at the same time, it also proved a point. Maybe this is a sign that something's going on. And that's exactly what these things do. Now, hexes in folklore rarely appear out of nowhere. So you definitely want to look for recent conflicts. Someone with a motive, knowledge, exposure to folk magic practitioners, possibly people who would know the cultural context of those kind of things, or whether the person has been dabbling in rituals without grounding. And that last one I'm going to tell you, I've seen people experiment with some stuff, and they've pulled up some pretty bad juju on themselves. Not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know what they were doing. They were following the directions from places like TikTok, but not realizing that there was probably more to the prep work than meets the eye. Yes, I know. I've always told people that there are certain mentalities. I did this when I was working at one place, and I said, this is what's recommended, but I know some parents, they have what I call, that intuition rule, that that you can have two kids the same age, and one you can hand them something like a fishing pole or a bow and arrow, and that they're going to be fine with it. Let's lessen it. Let's just say it's a slingshot, okay? You hand them the slingshot, they're going to have fun with it. They're not necessarily going to hurt no one. They're going to use common sense. Then there's the one you give the slingshot to, and you might as well just give them the keys to your car and tell them to teach yourself how to drive. Yeah, I know you're laughing, but if you think about that for a second, that's precisely the point. So I'll let you go ahead and fill in the blanks with that one, but that's what you're going to be running into. Now, to give you an example, as I mentioned before about the egg, that whole thing with the candle test I was telling about, if you want to find out, the ritual tests themselves, I know I did the water thing earlier, but let's just say you do the candle test, and still there, you want to basically have identical candles with them, and then on a stable surface, and then you just basically just light the candles. And what you're looking for is consistent anomalies, not one-off flickers, okay? And so if they start to, flicker or sputter in a certain way, that means that there's bad juju in the air, okay? If they're all steady and there's nothing going on, then you're pretty much in the clear. So what's another one that you can possibly think of? Well, As I mentioned with that one thing with the egg, depending on how the actual egg comes about, when you run it over your whole body, so to speak, you don't have to touch it, but just like you're like raking the energy around it. And then you crack it open and you drop it into a glass of water. And then how it starts to spike as the proteins congeal and they change their colors and what have you. It means stuff. If it's bubbling or whatnot, that means you got to go through a cleansing. What people don't realize is that some of the gases that are formed in that water with the egg create that bubbling and all those things. So, in essence, science is at work in another way. It's just circumstance. So, keep this in mind as you look at this. Does it mean it's real? Well, it could, but does it mean that you have to listen? I probably pay attention to it because it could be another sign, just like we were talking about earlier. So keep that. Go on. I know in some cases that if you want to be able to do certain things and find out if there is a way to be hexed and find out if you are, there are several ways, and I encourage you because as I did my research, I know anybody else can do the same. But one thing for sure is that these methods that I've given you, it's not harmful to do that because it brings about what they call grounding. And what that means is that you're able to kind of bring yourself to a point where common sense is a more channeled thing going through you as opposed to panic or fear, paranoia. And the reason why I say it that way is because I talked to a witch once, and they said to me, if I'm to attack somebody, I wouldn't put a hex on them. I wouldn't even try to cast a spell on them. No. I would make sure that they couldn't concentrate, and I would attack their grounding. By doing that, they can't focus on anything. It's much like for a bad analogy, an ADHD kid. You tell them to go and rake the leaves and they decide to go ride their bikes because, they started to rake and they left. That would be someone ungrounded. That's the point. So nothing gets done, nothing gets, accomplished, and they end up getting in a lot of trouble because they just don't know why. They're just doing these things. And that's pretty much why it is that it's good to at least try to stay focused, but also be able to carry out in a way and pay attention to the signs that things are possibly afoot or not. That's up for you to decide. So one thing for sure, as I was looking at some of these things, I did find some commonality that there were things that could indicate that in fact there was a problem or maybe there wasn't a problem. And in all of that, I did find that they had some commonality, and that is that it was a telltale sign that could mean you were hexed. But because science does play a role in this, because, they're all going to do things according to what's there, it could still be considered circumstance. It comes down to belief. So, as I mentioned before, when you look through this stuff and you get curious, do bear in mind that a lot of this is folklore, and although it can and could possibly be real, it might also be something that can be explained away. And I just want to put it out there like that. I'm sure you probably have heard people do things like when you spill salt, you throw it over your shoulder. Perhaps maybe if the door opens because you didn't close it right, that's a bad hex or whatever. If the milk spoils, or if you come out and you have livestock and they're all unrested and sweaty. Yeah, these are all signs, quote unquote. But there could be other reasons. They could be sickly. The milk could have been left out. And the list goes on. So, really, honestly, one way or the other, something can happen that could make you think it could be a hex. But if it could be explained, then maybe not. But if there's no explanation and there's some other weird thing going on, maybe there could be reason to pay attention to all of the signs around you at that point. And that's the key phrase, pay attention. Now, if you were to sit there and talk about this and look into it, you probably have to ask yourself, do I believe that I could be hexed? Or is it all just hearsay? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that. But if you do find yourself talking about it with other people and the things that you discover, hopefully, somewhere in there, you might actually find yourself talking about it with me. Where else? Friday Night Dark at nighttracks.com. Hey, this is Drew, and I bid you good night.